Welcome to Math 176, Intermediate Algebra. This PowerPoint will introduce each week and allow you to understand what concepts you will be covering. In week 1, we'll be looking at the basic concepts of linear and linear equations, starting all the way back from adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing real numbers. So those are positive and negative numbers. Then we will be able to use all of those skills in our order of operations. You'll remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. We will then move on to exponents and square roots and looking at combining like terms so that we can use the properties to simplify algebraic expressions, which will end the week then with solving first-degree linear equations. All of these skills are life skills that you have used and do use every day in your life, things like keeping a budget, keeping a checkbook log, organizing a time schedule. All of these things are essential in everyday life. In week 2, we will focus on some more equations, but into two variable equations so that we can graph them. We will be looking at slopes and figuring out how to find a slope of a line so that we can then solve story problems using equations. We will find slopes of non-vertical straight lines, meaning they have an angle to them, and we will also use 2 points to help determine if lines are parallel, perpendicular, or if they are neither, just non-vertical lines. We will then write equations given 2 points using slope-intercept form and point-slope form. In week 3, we will be changing to looking at polynomials. Polynomials are algebraic expressions that we use in many different concepts in math. We will be using them to solve quadratic equations here in a couple weeks. But there are skills that we need to be able to use in order to solve those equations. So nurses, psychiatric home health aides use polynomials to determine schedules and keep records of patient progress. All of these are essential with your major. In this week, we will be looking at factoring polynomials using many different methods, including the greatest common factor method, grouping methods, factoring special trinomials, factoring special cases like perfect square polynomials, and then learning how to factor using the skill of completing the square. In week 4, we will look at rational expressions and equations. So rational expressions are basically fractions that have variables in the numerators and the denominators. When we change a fraction from just a fraction with numbers to a fraction with variables in it, we have to call it a rational expression. However, the rules of what we can do with regular fractions still apply to what we can do with rational expressions. So we will be looking at those rules so that we can simplify these rational expressions and multiply and divide them. We will end the week by solving rational equations and including those that have no solution. In the nursing world, this would help us apply with proportions and ratios, all of which you will need in your job so that you can look at figuring out a patient's weight versus the correct dosage for medicine and things like that. In week 5, we will change and look into radicals within our rational expressions. So there are going to be some terms where they would have a rational exponent. We need to figure out how to work back and forth between that rational exponent and its radical expression. So we will learn to do that so that we can look at product rules and radical term rules so that we can simplify, multiply, and divide those expressions. We will end the week by learning how to do what we call rationalizing a denominator, which means we have a radical in a place of a fraction that we can't, and we will figure out how to get it out of that denominator. Moving on to week 6 is quadratic equations. These are really popular in the math world among many different types of math. You will see it in many of your different classes. Quadratics are those equations that create a curve of some sort. So throwing a ball, shooting a cannon. Anytime you have to figure out a situation where there is an arc or a curve in the model, we will be working with quadratic functions. So in this week, we will be learning how to solve those functions and equations using many different methods, including the square root property, completing the square, using the quadratic formula, and then finally solving quadratic equations by factoring. And finally, in week 7, you made it. This is the final week. We will end this class looking at logarithmic and exponential equations. Logarithmic and exponential equations are always grouped together because they are inverses of each other, which means they are opposites. We have learned that we are able to solve equations using inverse operations, so we will end this week solving exponential and log equations by using the other form. Earlier in the week, we will learn how to move back and forth between a logarithmic equation and its exponential form and vice versa, the exponential form into the log form, so that we can then study properties and look at special types of logs to finally end and solve logarithmic equations.